Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I had just moved into a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone keeps to themselves. The houses were neat, lawns trimmed, and the air smelled of fresh-cut grass. My new place was a modest two-story, tucked in a cul-de-sac. Perfect, I thought. Peaceful. It was late when I first noticed him, the neighbor in the house next door. I hadn't seen anyone when I moved in, but that night, through the window, I saw a man standing by the front door. He wasn't looking at me, but at something in the distance. Tall, thin, with hair too dark for the streetlights to illuminate. He wore a long coat despite the warmth of the evening. I figured he was just a late-night type of guy, so I went about my unpacking. But the next night, the same thing. I glanced out the window as I settled in for bed, and there he was again, standing perfectly still by the door, staring into the night. Curiosity started gnawing at me. Was he waiting for someone? A stranger, perhaps? But he never moved, just stood there like a statue, the chill of night creeping around him. Over the next few days, I started to notice more oddities. Every time I passed by his house, his blinds were drawn. I never saw him leave, or anyone else for that matter. The house was always silent, yet there were signs of life. The mailbox was emptied every day. The porch lights flickered on and off, like someone was coming and going, but the man was always standing in the same place at the same time. I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, after seeing him again standing motionless, I decided to finally introduce myself. I walked up to his front door and rang the bell. The door creaked open slowly, and he appeared, his face as pale as the moon. His eyes were dark, empty, like they hadn't seen daylight in years. "Can I help you?" His voice was soft, almost unnerving. I introduced myself, trying to ignore the unsettling aura he exuded. "I'm your neighbor. I've noticed you standing outside a lot. Is everything okay?" He blinked, his expression unreadable. "Everything is fine," he said simply. He paused. I like the quiet. I tried to smile. "Well, it's certainly peaceful. Here." He didn't reply. Instead, he stared at me for a long moment. "I'll see you around." I nodded and walked away quickly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The quiet was deafening. Too perfect. Then I heard something. A faint tapping on my window. I froze. The tapping came again, rhythmic, deliberate. I stood and peered through the blinds. There, standing. In the yard was the man, his head tilted upward, his face nearly pressed against the glass, watching me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. He hadn't been there a moment ago, and now he was just there, in my yard. I locked the window and tried to shake off the fear, but sleep wouldn't come. The tapping continued, each tap louder until it felt like it was inside my head. I finally forced myself to close my eyes. When I woke up, it was daylight. The tapping had stopped. The man was gone, and everything seemed normal. Too normal. I breathed a sigh of relief and decided I was just overthinking things. That was until I heard the sound again, this time coming from inside the house. Soft footsteps. They echoed down the hallway, moving closer to my bedroom. I froze, paralyzed by fear. Then I heard the voice. "Don't worry, I'm just watching." The man's voice. I turned to see him standing in my doorway, his dark eyes piercing through me. You're not supposed to be here," I whispered. He smiled, a cold, terrifying smile. I like the quiet too. Suddenly, I understood. He hadn't been watching the outside world. He had been watching me, waiting for me to be alone, waiting for the moment when the silence would break. I jumped out of bed and ran down the stairs, but the house had changed. The front door was locked, the windows sealed shut. Every exit was blocked. Every route leading back to him. He was everywhere, behind me, in front of me, his presence suffocating. "You're just like the others," he whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. "I wait for them to see me, but they never do. Until they do." And then there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was lying in the middle of my living room. The house was perfectly still. I stumbled to my feet, frantic, looking around, but the man was gone. Or was he? The door to my neighbor's house stood open, a faint red glow spilling out. The window was cracked, and I swore I saw his figure in the shadow, watching me. He had never left. He never would. The silence in the house was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I've always been a skeptic. Ghosts, spirits, haunted houses, never believed in them. So when I moved into the old house at the edge of town, I thought I was getting a bargain. The place was cheap, abandoned for years, and the walls needed some fresh paint, but nothing I couldn't handle. The first night, things were quiet. Just the usual creaks of an old house settling. But then, around midnight, I heard it. A knock. 3 sharp raps on the front door. I froze. I wasn't expecting anyone. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole. There was no one. Just darkness stretching out into the night. Maybe a prank, I thought. I shrugged it off, locking the door again, and tried to get back to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every few minutes it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 knocks. Always the same rhythm. I checked the door. Nothing. I checked the windows. Nothing. But the knocks kept coming, growing more insistent with each round. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, opened the door, and stepped outside, determined to catch whoever was messing with me. The yard was dark and empty. Nothing moved. I turned around to head back inside, but something caught my eye. In the window, I saw a shadow. It wasn't mine. It was taller, darker, and far too still. I froze, my heart hammering. The shadow didn't move, but it felt like it was watching me. I rushed back inside and slammed the door, locking it. The house felt colder now, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the knocking started again. 3 knocks. I couldn't ignore it any longer. This wasn't a prank. Something was happening here. I decided to take a look around, maybe check the basement, see if there was a logical explanation. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I made my way down into the dark, musty basement. The air was damp and smelled of old wood. The flashlight beam flickered as I scanned the room, my pulse quickening, and then I saw it. A door, hidden in the far corner of the basement. I hadn't noticed it before. It blended in with the wall. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. It opened with a soft groan. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The air was colder here. I stepped in and shined my flashlight around. There was nothing but dust-covered furniture and old boxes. But something about the room made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned around, heart pounding. There, standing in the corner, was a figure. It was a man, tall, gaunt, and draped in a dark cloak. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me. His presence was suffocating. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a slow step forward, then another, and another. My pulse raced. I tried the door, but it wouldn't open. I was trapped. I turned back to the figure, who was now only a few feet away. His cold, hollow eyes locked onto mine. And then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Before I could react, the room plunged into complete darkness. My flashlight flickered out, and I was plunged into an abyss of silence. I couldn't hear anything, no movement, no breath, just my own frantic heartbeat. A cold hand brushed against my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The door creaked open behind me. I didn't hesitate. I ran up the stairs. The house, now eerily silent, as if it were holding its breath. I burst through the front door and ran into the night, never looking back. The next day, I called a locksmith to change the locks. When I went down into the basement again, the hidden door was gone. The walls were solid, as if it had never existed. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. 3 knocks. This time, though, the knock wasn't on the door. It came from inside the room. I knew with terrifying certainty that whatever was in that house had never left. I was driving alone through the back roads, far from the nearest town. The kind of roads that twisted like veins in the dark, where even your headlights seemed to struggle to light the way. It was late, past midnight, and the fog had rolled in thick. My windshield wipers fought against it, but the mist clung to the glass, blurring my vision. The radio was silent, not even static, just an empty hum. Then the voice crackled through. "Turn back," it whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I slammed the volume dial, but the voice didn't stop. It continued, just a breath above the static. "Turn back. Now." I froze, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The voice was soft, eerily calm. No mistake, it came from the radio. But I knew no one had touched the dial. I had been alone in the car. I glanced at the road ahead, but it felt like I wasn't moving at all. My headlights barely pierced the fog, and something in my gut twisted. My heart raced, thudding like a drum. I wasn't sure if I should keep driving, but I pressed on. The fog thickened, and my car slowed of its own accord as though the road itself was pulling me in. The voice continued. "You're not alone." My eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror. Nothing but white. But that's when I heard it. A low, whistling sound. Soft at first, like a breeze through the trees. But it was close. Too close. It was a tune, almost melodic but haunting, like a lullaby from a nightmare. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, but my pulse wouldn't slow. The road ahead twisted, the fog so dense now that it felt like a wall pressing in from all sides. The whistling grew louder. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from outside the car, a slow, deliberate whistle, the kind that you'd hear from someone walking behind you, following you. I couldn't see anything in the rearview mirror. No shadow, no silhouette. But the sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I needed to get out of the fog, fast. But the more I drove, the more the whistling seemed to draw closer, matching my speed. Then, a sharp gust of wind slammed into my side window, rattling the glass. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel tighter. That's when I saw it. A figure just ahead, standing by the side of the road. I nearly slammed on the brakes, hard in my throat, but I couldn't. I was frozen. The figure was tall, gaunt, its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A dark coat billowed in the mist around it, and in its hand was a lantern, a single flickering light, illuminating only the figure's shadowed form. I slammed the brakes, coming to a screeching halt just inches from the figure. The whistling stopped. Everything stopped. My headlights now illuminated the figure fully. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from beneath the brim of the hat, the light from its lantern casting an eerie glow. I could barely breathe. It was as if time had frozen. But then it took a step forward. One slow, deliberate step. And that's when the radio blared to life again. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was louder now, urgent. "Run! Don't let it in!" The figure didn't move. It was still standing in the fog, but I could feel the air shift. A presence, a cold that made my bones ache. My foot was on the gas, before I could think. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get away. My tires screamed against the gravel as I sped off, the figure disappearing into the mist behind me. I didn't stop again. I didn't look back. When I finally reached a gas station miles down the road, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that something was still out there. The station attendant stared at me with wide eyes when I pulled up. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you all right?" he asked finally, his voice shaking. I couldn't find words. I just pointed to the radio. The dial was still flickering, static, buzzing. He nodded grimly and reached behind the counter, pulling out an old map. "You didn't hear the whistling, did you?" he asked. I nodded slowly, my chest tight. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he scribbled something on the map. "Stay on the main roads. Whatever you do, don't take the back roads at night. It calls to you." He handed me the map, his eyes full of something I couldn't name, something dark. "The Whistler doesn't let you leave once. You've heard it." I couldn't bring myself to ask him what that meant. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see that lantern's light, but the road behind me was empty. The voice on the radio never came back. The whistling never followed me again, but I never drove those back roads again. I don't even know what I would have done if I had, and I'll never forget that cold whisper, "You're not alone." I never liked traveling at night, but work had kept me late, and the last train was my only option. I made my way to the empty platform, the station dim and quiet, its flickering lights casting long shadows. The air felt unnaturally still, and even the usual hum of the train station seemed muted. I glanced at my watch. The train should have been here by now. Then, from the dark end of the platform, I saw the headlights. The train was approaching, but something about it felt off. It wasn't the usual commuter train. This one was old, the metal of its carriages gleaming in the dim light, too clean for the rundown station. As it stopped in front of me, I noticed there were no passengers, not even a conductor in sight, just a silent, waiting train. I hesitated for a moment, then climbed aboard. The door slid open on its own, creaking like it hadn't been used in years. Inside, the train was pristine. Strange, considering the station. The seats were covered in dark velvet, and chandeliers hung from the ceiling, glowing softly, giving the whole place an eerie, almost regal atmosphere. I chose an empty seat, trying to ignore the odd feeling creeping over me. The train jerked into motion, its wheels screeching as it left the station. I looked out the window, but all I could see was blackness. The train seemed to be traveling deeper into nothingness. As we moved along, I noticed something. The windows, despite being clean, had no reflection of the inside of the train. Just darkness. There were no passing lights from outside, no other cars, no people on the tracks. I turned back to the aisle. The train was still empty except for one other figure sitting 2 rows in front of me, an elderly man in a tattered coat. He was staring, out the window, unmoving, his back to me. His hands were tightly clenched on the armrests, but I couldn't see his face. I was about to get up to find the conductor when I heard a soft sound, like a whisper, coming from behind me. I froze, every hair on my neck standing up. The train was completely silent except for the low hum of the wheels on the track. The whisper came again, just barely audible, like someone was trying not to be heard. I turned quickly to look at the old man, but he was still facing the window. I couldn't see his face, just the back of his head, a few strands of hair fluttering with the movement of the train. I felt a chill creep up my spine, my gut telling me something wasn't right. The whisper grew louder, more insistent this time, though still just a faint breath of sound. "Not safe. Don't look." I glanced at my phone. The time had stopped. It was frozen at 11:42 p.m. I stood up abruptly, heart pounding, and hurried toward the front of the train, passing the old man without a second glance. As I neared the front car, the whisper stopped, replaced by a soft tapping noise. I turned to see a young woman, dressed in a white dress, standing in the middle of the aisle. She was staring straight ahead, her hair covering her face. I instinctively took a step back, but she didn't move. "Excuse me, are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. Slowly, almost mechanically, she raised her head. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty, as if they had been drained of all life. My stomach churned. I opened my mouth to speak again, but the words died in my throat. Then, the whisper came again, this time unmistakable. "Get off!" The woman's lips didn't move, but the words were clear, ringing in my ears. I looked around, panic flooding my chest. There were no other passengers, and I couldn't hear the train anymore. Just silence. And then it hit me. The train had stopped. We weren't moving. I turned and bolted down the aisle, but as I ran, the lights flickered, plunging the train into complete darkness. I stumbled, but I didn't stop. The air was thick now, like I was running through water. My breath came in sharp gasps as I reached the doors. I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't open. I tugged harder, panic rising in my throat. Behind me, I heard the woman's footsteps, the tapping sound growing closer. I whirled around to face her, but she wasn't there. And then I heard the voice, clear, cold, and chilling. "You're the last." The train lurched, the lights coming back on, and I finally managed to wrench open the door. I stumbled out onto the tracks, the station ahead of me. The train was gone, swallowed by the dark. I ran back to the platform, gasping for breath, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. The station was completely empty now. The night was quiet, still. The train was gone, and I was alone. I looked down at my phone, still frozen at 11:42. That's when I noticed it. A message had appeared on my screen, just one word: "Don't." It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. My friend Emily had invited me to spend the weekend at her family's old lakeside cabin, the kind of place that was supposed to help clear your head, with the sounds of waves lapping at the shore and birds chirping in the trees. It was supposed to be relaxing, but from the moment I arrived, something felt off. The cabin was quaint but a little too isolated. The trees around it were thick, the lake calm but eerie under the fading light. Emily greeted me at the door with her usual bright smile, but there was a nervous edge to her voice when she said, "I'm glad you made it. Just don't wander too far into the woods, okay?" I laughed it off, assuming it was just her usual anxiety. "I'll be fine. It's just the woods, right?" She didn't seem convinced, but led me inside. The cabin was old, the floors creaking with every step. She gave me the tour: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small living area with a fireplace. But there was one door I kept noticing, tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway. "What's in there?" I asked. Emily froze for a moment, her face pale. "Oh, that's just the cellar. It's locked up. Nothing special." She quickly moved on to another room. That night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I kept glancing out the windows, the darkness outside swallowing up the light from the cabin. There was no moon, just an endless stretch of blackness. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. As I lay in bed, the house creaked and groaned with the wind. But something else was there too. Soft, almost imperceptible footsteps in the hallway. It was so faint, I thought it might be my imagination. But the sound was distinct. I got up to check, convinced it was just the house settling. But as I stepped into the hallway, the sound stopped. Everything was still. The only thing I could hear was my own breath. That's when I saw it. A pair of eyes. They glowed faintly in the dark just above the cellar door at the end of the hall. 2 small, almost human-like eyes watching me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the glow was gone. I quickly rushed back to my room, locking the door behind me. Emily was still asleep, unaware of what I had just seen. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just a trick of the light, a reflection from the window, maybe. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, Emily was unusually quiet. She didn't want to talk about the night before, and when I mentioned the eyes, she grew pale. "You saw them too, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "The eyes in the dark," she said, her voice trembling. "They come out at night, and they're not human." I laughed nervously, not sure whether to believe her. But something in her face told me she was serious. "We need to leave," she said, her voice cracking. "We shouldn't have come here." But it was too late. That evening, as the sun began to set, I went to the window and glanced outside. The woods were silent, unnaturally so. Then, in the distance, I saw it. Movement. Figures, shaped like shadows, moving between the trees. They were too fast to be human. Before I could say anything, the door to the cellar creaked open. I could hear soft, shuffling footsteps growing louder and closer. Panic surged through me as I turned to Emily. She was standing by the door, her face pale and wide-eyed, staring at the cellar. "I told you not to look," she whispered. "They're here." Suddenly, the cellar door swung open, and out from the dark emerged a figure. Tall, thin, covered in shadow, its face twisted into a grotesque grin. Its eyes shone bright like burning embers in the dark, watching us, studying us. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The thing in the doorway stepped closer, its eyes gleaming in the faint light. Emily screamed, and for the first time, I heard a sound coming from the thing, a low growl, vibrating through the floorboards, filling the room. It stepped forward, its form now visible, its limbs too long, too unnatural. I grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the window. But as we got closer, I saw the reflection in the glass. There were more, hundreds of eyes, all glowing, watching us from the woods. They were coming closer. I don't remember how we got out, but I remember running, and I remember the eyes following us, getting closer and closer with every step we took. When we finally reached the car, I looked back. The cabin was gone. The woods had swallowed it whole, leaving only darkness. We drove for hours, never looking back. But I know what I saw, and I know those eyes are still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too close, waiting to stare into the dark, waiting to make them part of the shadows. I should have never gotten on that train. It was late, the platform empty except for me and a few tired commuters. The overhead lights flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I checked my watch, just past midnight. The last train of the night. I'd been traveling for hours, exhausted, and wanted nothing more than to sleep through the ride. When the train pulled in, it was old, creaky, with rust on the edges of the doors and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. The conductor, an older man with a weathered face, stood at the door, motioning for us to board. I was the only one who stepped on. The train was nearly empty except for a single passenger sitting in the far corner. He was hunched over, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, his coat a dark, tattered thing. I slid into a seat near the front, trying to avoid eye contact. As the train lurched forward, I settled in, pulling my jacket tighter against the cold draft that seemed to seep from the walls. The rhythmic clatter of the train on the tracks was soothing at first, but soon it began to feel off. Too loud, like it was rattling deeper than it should, scraping the metal in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore it, pulling out my phone to check the time. That's when I noticed something strange. There was no signal. I glanced up. The lights flickered again, and the overhead speaker crackled to life, making an eerie sound. But instead of the usual announcements, a low voice whispered through the Static. Don't look at the man in the corner. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly turned my head toward the far corner of the car. The figure was still there, motionless, but somehow it felt like he was closer. My heart raced as I turned back to the window, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The voice came again, clearer this time, but still muffled, as if coming from a long distance. His eyes are waiting. He's already seen you. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I gripped the armrest, my fingers trembling. The train rattled again, harder this time, and the lights flickered once more, casting long shadows across the floor. I couldn't help myself. I turned to look again. This time, the man in the corner was staring directly at me. His face, pale and gaunt, was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but his eyes, black, hollow pits, seemed to bore into mine. He smiled, just a slight curling of his lips, and I felt the air around me grow even colder. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is this the last stop?" The man didn't move, but the conductor appeared at the front of the car. His face was pale, his eyes wide with an expression that wasn't fear, but something else, something far worse. He glanced nervously at the man in the corner and then back, at me. "You need to get off the train," the conductor said, his voice shaking. "Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, but when I reached the handle, it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. That's when the man in the corner stood up. His movement was slow, deliberate. He took one step toward me, and the train's lights flickered once more, casting everything in an unnatural, sickly glow. "Get off." The conductor's voice was desperate now. "The train never stops. It never goes anywhere." I turned, scrambling toward the exit at the far end, but the man was in front of me now, too fast, his long, pale fingers wrapping around my wrist. His grip was cold, unyielding. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered, his breath a rotten stench in my face. I fought against him, my pulse hammering in my ears, but it was like trying to fight against a stone wall. He dragged me toward the rear of the train, and the walls seemed to close in, the metal groaning under pressure. The conductor had vanished. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop. The world outside the window was pitch black. No lights, no stars, just an empty void. The man let go of my wrist, stepping back. "You're one of us now," he said, his smile wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. Then everything went quiet. I was still in the train. The seats were empty. The lights flickered again, but I could hear nothing but my own breath. The train didn't move. It didn't even seem to be on tracks anymore. It just sat in an endless black void, waiting, and I realized, too late, that the last stop had already passed. The train had been on its way to nowhere for years, and now it had me. I didn't want to stay in the apartment, but I had no choice. It was temporary, just a few months until I found something more permanent. It was a top-floor unit in an old building, the kind with creaky stairs and faded wallpaper, but it was cheap, and that's all that mattered to me. The first few nights were uneventful. The neighbors kept to themselves, and the city noise felt distant, muffled by the thick walls. But after a week, something strange started happening. At night, when everything was still, I would hear a faint sound. It started small, just a tap, like something delicate being knocked against the floor. I'd freeze, listening, but the noise would stop as soon as I tried to find its source. At first, I figured it was just the building settling, some odd noises from pipes or loose floorboards, but it kept happening, every night without fail. It wasn't until I was in the living room one evening, alone, that I heard it again. A tap, then another. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked toward the center of the room. The noise was coming, from below me, from the floor. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as I listened, almost rhythmic. I knelt down, pressing my ear against the floor. It sounded like something scraping, a slow, deliberate motion. The apartment was empty. I was alone. I stood up quickly, heart thudding in my chest. The noise stopped immediately. I stared at the floor, wondering if I had imagined it. The next few nights, it was worse. The tapping became sharper, like a set of nails or something harder, hitting the wood in a steady pattern. Sometimes it sounded like scratching, other times, a rhythmic thumping. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my pulse pounding in my ears, listening as it came from below, from under the floor. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The building was old, but it felt like the noise was coming from something more alive. I called the landlord, but he dismissed it as just old house noises. He suggested I leave a note for the neighbors below to see if they heard it too. The neighbors were quiet, and they always kept to themselves. I wrote the note, slipped it under their door, and waited. A day later, I got a reply. "We don't hear anything." I wanted to scream, to tell them that something was wrong, but I held it together. That night, the tapping was louder than ever, shaking the floor beneath me. But this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was a thudding, a sharp, desperate banging against the floor. Something was scraping, dragging itself across the wood beneath me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen in the middle of the room. Suddenly, the banging stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Then, from below, I heard a voice. "Let me out." The words were soft at first, a whisper that barely reached my ears. But the longer I listened, the clearer they became. The voice wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from below, from the very floor itself. "Let me out. Please." I stumbled back, my head spinning. The voice was pleading now, desperate. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my spine. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but before I could, the voice broke through again. "I can hear you. I'm here." The words hit me like a punch. The voice, it knew I was there. It wasn't just asking to be let out. It was warning me. I backed away from the floor, terrified, but something urged me to look closer. There was a small crack in the wood, barely noticeable, but it was enough. The edges of the crack seemed to be moving, as though something was trying to push through from below. Then I saw it. A hand. A pale, bony hand appeared through the crack, fingers splayed wide as though it was reaching for me. The fingers scraped against the floorboards, the sound like nails on chalkboard, and I recoiled, almost falling backward in panic. I didn't wait to see more. I ran out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get away. I stayed with a friend for a week, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that apartment was still waiting, still trying to get out. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I couldn't stop thinking about the hand, what it wanted, what it was. When I finally returned to pack up my things, I found that the apartment was empty. The floors scraped clean of the cracks and scratches. There was no sign of the hand, no sound of tapping, nothing out of place. But when I left, I saw it. The neighbor's door was open, and through the crack I saw them, just standing there, watching me. Their eyes were dark, empty, and in the stillness, I heard the same voice from below, soft but chilling. "You shouldn't have left." I'd been on the road for hours when I saw the sign, Shady Pines Rest Area. I was exhausted and figured it would be a good place to stretch my legs. The sun had long set, and the highway had become a desolate stretch of road. I pulled in, the only car in the lot. The rest area was dimly lit, with a small building in the middle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I didn't mind. I needed a break. Inside, the air was stale, with a faint smell of mildew. The lights flickered above me as I walked to the vending machines. As I passed the bathrooms, I noticed the door to the women's restroom was slightly A jar, a sound like faint singing drifting through the crack. I paused, listening. It was soft, melodic, almost hypnotic. But there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. I took a few steps closer. The singing stopped. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing. Was someone in there? Should I check? Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open. The restroom was empty. There was no sign of anyone. Just old stalls, cracked mirrors, and a flickering light above. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. The soft, distant singing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was coming from the farthest stall. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone. It was seductive, like it was pulling me toward it. Without thinking, I took a step forward, then another, until I was right at the stall. The singing stopped again. I reached for the door, my hand trembling. Just as I touched it, the voice spoke. Clearer this time. Come in, I've been waiting. My heart pounded. I jerked my hand back. The voice sounded like a woman, but there was something wrong about it. The tone was too sweet, too inviting, like a lullaby meant to lure you to sleep. I turned to run, but before I could move, the door to the restroom slammed shut behind me. The room plunged into darkness, the faint hum of the lights the only sound. Then, I heard it. Soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing across the tile. I spun around, trying to see through the pitch-black room. My breath hitched. A figure, pale and thin, appeared in the dim light from under the door. The voice spoke again, this time right behind me. I'm so glad you came. I whirled around. There was no one there, but the air felt thick, suffocating. I heard her voice, once more, whispering directly into my ear, though she wasn't close. You shouldn't have come here. You'll never leave. I ran. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get out. The restroom door crashed open and I stumbled into the parking lot, my breath ragged. The air was colder now, and the hum of the lights had become a low, threatening buzz. The parking lot was still empty. My car was exactly where I'd left it. But something was different. A figure stood at the edge of the lot by the trees, tall, silhouetted against the dark. I froze. The figure stepped forward and I saw her face. Her skin was as white as bone, her eyes black voids. Her lips were curled into a twisted, unnatural smile, and her hair floated around her face as if it were underwater. Not so fast, she said, her voice ringing in my ears. You can't leave me. I bolted to my car, fumbling for my keys. My hands were slick with sweat, but I finally managed to unlock the door and jump in. I slammed it shut, locking it, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I sped out of the lot, my tires screeching. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness swallowing the headlights. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me. In my rearview mirror, I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing faintly, watching me. The woman. Her face was pressed to the glass just inches from mine, grinning that same twisted smile. I slammed my foot down harder on the gas, but no matter how fast I drove, she stayed there, never leaving, her eyes never leaving mine. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I crossed the sign that said Shady Pines Rest Area once again. But this time, the town was gone. I drove straight through, and I never went back. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear the soft singing, waiting for me to return. It was an old, abandoned factory on the edge of town. Not a place many people dared go. My friends and I had always been curious, but no one in town had been inside for years. The factory stood at the outskirts, shrouded in overgrown weeds and tangled metal. The windows were cracked and the once bold graffiti now faded and peeling. It wasn't the kind of place you would stumble upon by accident. It felt hidden, as though the town itself had forgotten it existed. We didn't plan on staying long, just a quick look inside to satisfy our curiosity. My friends, Jason, Rachel, and I, were eager to see what was left of the old place. It wasn't the typical abandoned factory either. Something about the building felt off, like it had never been entirely empty. The front door creaked as we pushed it open. Dust drifted in the air and the faint smell of metal and decay hit us immediately. The floors were covered in grime and debris, and broken machinery loomed in the corners, casting long, distorted shadows. The place seemed vast, too big for what we knew the factory to have produced. "This place feels different from the stories," Rachel said, her voice low. "I thought it was just an old factory, but I don't know." "I know what you mean," I replied, stepping further in. The air felt thick, heavy, almost as if it had weight. Jason nodded, staying silent as we explored deeper. That's when we heard it. The faintest sound, like whispers carried by the wind. We paused, glancing at each other, unsure if we had heard anything at all. The factory was silent again. "Must be the wind," Jason said, breaking the silence, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We pressed on, following the faint trail of flickering light from broken windows. The further we went, the quieter the building seemed. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed sound, and the darkness pressed in around us. Time felt warped in that space. Minutes turned into hours without us noticing. Suddenly, we heard it again, only this time, louder. A low whisper, distant at first, but growing clearer. I tried to dismiss it, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere. My heart started to race. Jason froze in place, his expression tense. "It's not the wind," Rachel whispered. "Where's it coming from?" The whispers grew more distinct, forming words, though they were unintelligible at first. But then they began to sound like voices, multiple indistinct murmurs blending together. The more we listened, the clearer they became. "Help. Help us. Leave. Don't stay." The voices weren't speaking in any language we could recognize. They were haunting, distorted, as though they were trying to tell us something. Something we couldn't grasp. The lights from the windows flickered erratically. Shadows began to move again, blurred shapes dancing across the walls. It was as if the factory itself was alive, breathing, shifting. The ground beneath our feet felt colder, and the whispers became louder, more desperate. "We need to get out of here," Jason muttered, his voice cracking. His flashlight trembled in his hand. As we turned to leave, the whispers turned into something darker, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from deep within the factory. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, twisting and contorting into forms that we couldn't quite see. The air grew colder still, and the growl deepened into a roar. Suddenly, we heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing behind us. We spun around, but there was nothing there, just more shadows, shifting, always just out of sight. "Run!" Rachel screamed, and we didn't hesitate. We bolted toward the door, our footsteps pounding against the creaking floor. The whispers followed us, louder than ever. They seemed to be all around, surrounding us, closing in. We didn't look back. The door swung open, letting in the harsh light of the outside world. We stumbled into the darkness of the factory grounds, our breaths ragged. The voices faded behind us, but the echoes of them lingered. The factory stood silent once more. Empty, forgotten. But we knew something had followed us, something that was never supposed to be found. We never went back, and we never will. It started with a simple trip to a remote industrial zone, long abandoned and forgotten. My friends and I had heard rumors of a place no one dared enter, an old factory complex deep in the heart of an isolated stretch of land, untouched by time. The internet was full of stories, some claiming strange occurrences, whispers of ghosts that haunted the empty buildings. We wanted to explore it, curiosity outweighing caution. We arrived under the cover of night, the crumbling factory buildings looming in the dim glow of our flashlights. The air was thick, laden with dust and the faint scent of decay. The towering chimneys rose like jagged fingers against the dark sky. We moved cautiously, each step crunching on broken concrete and debris. Inside the main building, we found a room filled with faded machinery, rusted pipes, and the faint echo of our footsteps. The silence was oppressive, the kind that presses down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. There were no windows, only the faint glow of our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The ceiling creaked above us, as though the building itself was unsettled by our presence. Then the whispers began. Faint at first, like the wind brushing through the empty halls. But they didn't sound natural. They came from within the walls, distorted, unintelligible. It wasn't the wind after all. They seemed to be carried through the very foundation of the building. We stopped moving, our eyes darting to each other, unsure if we'd heard right. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "Yes," Ryan said, his flashlight trembling. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. A low, guttural murmur, as if they were coming from deep below, surfacing from the shadows of the earth itself. The air grew colder, and we felt as though we were being watched. Something was down there, beneath us. We couldn't see it, but we knew it wasn't human. Suddenly, a faint scraping sound echoed from the direction of a nearby hallway. We froze. The whispers intensified, mingling with the noise, growing louder, more insistent. A faint, flickering light appeared at the end of the corridor, casting unnatural shadows that danced across the broken walls. "Go?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. We didn't argue. We moved quickly, our footsteps hurried as we retraced our path. The whispers followed us, now echoing through the halls in unison, becoming a cacophony of distorted sounds. It was as if whatever had been lurking in the darkness was closing in. As we reached the entrance, something unexpected happened. The whispers abruptly ceased, replaced by a sudden, oppressive silence. We hesitated at the threshold, our hearts pounding. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Something was there, waiting. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Not just our flashlights, but the entire complex, as if the building itself was coming to life. The shadows became more distinct, growing longer, stretching toward us as, though drawn by some unseen force, a final chilling whisper echoed in my ear, clear as day this time. "Leave." We didn't wait. We ran, out into the night, away from that cursed place. The factory loomed behind us, dark and silent once again. When we looked back, there was nothing. No signs of life, no evidence that we had ever been there. Now, months later, I can still hear those whispers at night. No one believes me when I tell them, but I know what I heard. I know we were not alone, and whatever was down there, whatever remains, watches, waiting, always. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated. At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck. soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. "Just the house settling," Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. "Could be an animal," Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. "Go away." I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. "It's nothing," Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. "Just the ocean." But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. "Leave." I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist in the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. "It's here," I gasped. "It's still here." Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. "Leave now." Panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. It wasn't supposed to be a haunted house. I had rented the old Victorian on a whim, seeking a quiet getaway from the stress of the city. The listing had boasted about its charm, the antique furnishings, and the picturesque location. What it didn't mention were the strange occurrences that came with it. The first night, nothing happened. The house was quiet, old, but cozy, and I was relieved to have some peace. But by morning, I noticed something odd. One of the mirrors in the hallway, an ornate piece above the console table, was slightly askew. I knew I hadn't touched it, but it wasn't worth worrying about. I straightened it and went on with my day. That evening, the air felt thicker. The house was still, save for the occasional creak of wood. As I made my way through the hallway to the kitchen, something caught my eye. A figure in the mirror. I froze. A woman. She stood there, facing away from me, her back to the glass. She had dark hair that cascaded down her back, but no face. The mirror reflected only the blackness where her face should be. My heart raced. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. I spun back to the mirror. Nothing, just my reflection. I must have imagined it, I thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, the house seemed louder. The silence had become suffocating. As I prepared for bed, I passed the mirror again. This time, I saw her more clearly. A woman in a tattered gown, her hands hanging limp by her sides. She was staring directly at me, her face still missing. I gasped and backed away, my pulse thudding in my chest. I knew I should leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The woman's presence felt real, like she was there but not there, like she was waiting. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and forced myself to move. But as I passed the mirror, I swore I heard a whisper. "Help me." I spun around, my heart in my throat, but the hallway was empty again. The mirror, empty. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt eyes on me. When I dared peek at the mirror once more, there was nothing, just my reflection staring back, wild-eyed and frantic. The next day, I called the number on the listing, asking for information about the house's history. The woman on the other end of the line hesitated. "I'm afraid we don't have much to share," she said, her voice tight. "But don't stay in the room with the mirror at night." I was about to ask more, but the line clicked dead. The strange warning gnawed at me. That night I stayed in the living room, avoiding the hallway. I thought if I didn't look at the mirror, nothing would happen. I was wrong. Around midnight I heard footsteps, soft, echoing against the wooden floors. Slowly I turned my head, my stomach dropping. The woman stood in the hallway again, her form indistinct, a dark void where her face should have been. She took a step forward, then another. I could hear the sound of fabric dragging against the floor, like the hem of her gown scraping along. The boards! I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman's feet didn't touch the ground. She glided closer, her black eyes locked on mine. And then, with a sudden jerk, her face appeared in the mirror. Not a blank void, but a twisted, contorted face with hollow, gaping eyes. Her mouth stretched wide into a silent scream. I turned. Away, stumbling back in terror, and when I looked again, she was gone. The mirror reflected only my own wide-eyed panic. I didn't wait. I ran from the house, not daring to look back. I didn't care if I was leaving behind my things or the house itself. The front door slammed behind me, and I never once looked back. To this day, I have no idea who or what the woman was. But sometimes, late at night, when I pass by mirrors, I swear I see her face just behind mine, waiting. When I was a kid, my family lived on a small farm at the edge of a sprawling cornfield. It wasn't the idyllic countryside you'd see in paintings. Our house was old and creaky, and the cornfield seemed endless, especially at night. It was the kind of place where silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on you when the wind wasn't blowing. One summer evening, my parents went into town for supplies, leaving me and my older brother in charge of the place. The sun had just set, leaving streaks of orange and purple on the horizon. We were supposed to feed the animals and lock up the barn, but instead, we decided to play hide-and-seek in the cornfield. The rules were simple. Stay within the first 10 rows and don't go too far from the house. My brother, always the braver one, volunteered to hide first. He darted into the tall stalks of corn while I counted to 50. The corn rustled as he moved, the sound growing fainter as he pushed deeper into the field. When I finished counting, I called out for him, stepping into the rows with a mix of excitement and unease. The corn loomed high above me, blocking out the moonlight. Every step felt louder than it should have, the dry leaves brushing against my arms and legs. "Come out," I called, trying to sound confident. No answer, just the soft whisper of the wind moving through the corn. I laughed nervously, convinced he was trying to scare me. I pushed forward, parting the stalks, my heart thumping a little harder with every step. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound ahead of me, like footsteps, dragging through the dirt. I froze, listening. "Gotcha!" I yelled, sprinting toward the noise, but when I burst through the stalks, I stopped cold. It wasn't my brother. There was someone standing there, just a few rows ahead of me, their back turned. They were tall and unnaturally thin, with arms hanging too long by their sides. "Jason," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. My heart pounded as I backed away, trying to retrace my steps. But as I turned, I realized I was lost. The rows of corn looked the same in every direction, and the farmhouse was nowhere in sight. I called out for my brother again, panic rising in my chest. That's when I heard the laughter. It wasn't loud, it was faint and distant, like it was being carried on the wind. But it wasn't Jason's laugh. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from a throat that didn't quite know how to laugh. The rustling started again, this time from all around me. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was everywhere. My breathing grew shallow as I stumbled through the rows, the stalks closing in tighter. Then I saw it again, the figure. But this time, it was closer. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if it was trying to see me without turning all the way around. The laughter came again, louder now, and I bolted, pushing through the corn as fast as I could. The stalks scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I burst into the clearing near the house, panting and covered in dirt. Jason was standing by the barn, holding a flashlight, his face pale. "Where were you?" he yelled, his voice trembling. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he cut me off. "We need to go inside. Now." That's when I noticed it. His hands were shaking, and his flashlight beam kept darting to the edge of the cornfield. I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. The figure was standing at the edge of the field, half hidden in the shadows. Its face was still obscured, but I could see its arms, long, spindly things that hung down past its knees. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, almost insect-like. We ran inside, slamming the door and locking it. Jason pulled the curtains shut, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking out. The figure was gone, but the cornfield seemed alive, swaying as if something was moving through it. We didn't sleep that night. When my parents came home the next morning, we told them what had happened. They didn't believe us, of course, but they didn't have to. That afternoon, we found footprints in the dirt outside the barn. They were huge, far too big to belong to any human, and leading from the footprints were drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled back into the cornfield. We never played hide-and-seek again. It was a quiet, ordinary evening when we decided to explore the old tunnel beneath the city. The tunnel wasn't exactly hidden, but it wasn't well known either, just a place some kids had talked about exploring years ago. My friends and I, curious and bored, thought it might make for an interesting adventure. None of us expected what we would find. The entrance was hidden under a narrow bridge, overgrown with weeds, covered in graffiti. It smelled of damp earth and decay. As we walked down, flashlights cutting through the darkness, the air grew colder and the walls seemed to press in around us. The tunnel stretched ahead, endless, lit only by the faint glow of our headlights. First, everything felt normal. The tunnel echoed with the sound of our footsteps and the strange whispers of the wind. But the deeper we went, the more the feeling of unease settled over us. My friends joked, trying to lighten the mood, but I could tell we were all on edge. There was something oppressive about the tunnel, as if it had been waiting for us. Then we heard it. Faint, distant at first, like a whisper. "Help! Help!" We exchanged uneasy glances. The voice wasn't loud enough to make sense of, but it seemed to resonate through the tunnel like a ghostly echo. I knew then that we were no longer alone. One of my friends, Sam, called out hesitantly. "Hello? Is someone down there?" The response came again, louder this time. "Help! Help! Please!" This time it was clearer, as if someone was begging us from the darkness. We hesitated, unsure whether to respond or run, but something about the desperation in that voice kept us rooted in place. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. The silence that followed was worse than any response. We listened to the sound of our own breathing, the faint drip of water from the ceiling. Then, another sound, soft, dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. "Please." "Help! I'm trapped," the voice called again, but this time it was closer. We didn't move. The flashlight beams swept the shadows searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing to be seen. The tunnel stretched endlessly, the darkness swallowing the light. Suddenly, something shifted. A figure emerged from the blackness. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The shape was twisted, elongated, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it moved toward us. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, empty and hollow, like voids in the darkness. "Help!" the figure rasped, its voice distorted, as though speaking from a place far beyond our world. We backed away, panic surging through us. The tunnel seemed to stretch further, the walls closing in around us. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't something we could fight. Without thinking, we turned and ran. The tunnel echoed with our footsteps, the strange cries of the figure fading behind us. I didn't stop until we burst out into the cold night air, gasping and trembling. None of us looked back. To this day, I don't know what we saw. The tunnel remains beneath the city, hidden, waiting. I've tried to convince myself it was a dream, a trick of the light, but I know better. Something is down there, something that shouldn't be disturbed. I still hear the voice sometimes, calling from the dark, and I know I'll never forget it. It started during the drive home. My family had been on a long road trip, no set destination, just miles of open highway. It was supposed to be relaxing, a way to escape the monotony of everyday life. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty roads. The car was quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets outside. We were nearly home when the first strange thing happened. I was sitting in the back seat, staring out the window, lost in thought, when I saw something move in the corner of my eye. It wasn't something outside, though, inside the car. A faint shimmer, like someone standing just outside my window, but inside the car. My stomach twisted. I turned to look, but there was nothing, just the empty highway and my family. "Did you see that?" I asked my parents, my voice shaky. "See what?" My dad replied, his eyes still on the road. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling, but the sensation of being watched didn't leave. The sun had set completely by then, leaving just the pale glow of the headlights cutting through the darkness. I could feel the tension rising, my heart pounding harder as the landscape sped by. The next time I noticed it, it was more persistent. I couldn't see anything out the windows, but I could feel it. Eyes on me, eyes inside the car. It was like something had slipped into the back seat with me. I turned around, but again, nothing. I was just about to ask my parents if they felt it too when I heard a faint whisper, so quiet I almost convinced myself it was just the wind. But then, louder, clearer. "Look behind you." I froze. My breath hitched and I gripped the edge of the seat. I turned slowly, my eyes wide, expecting to see something, anything. There was nothing. The empty back seat stared back at me. "What's wrong?" my mom asked, her voice full of concern. I tried to shrug it off, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something, or someone, was there, just behind me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a figure, but the car was still empty. Then it happened again. Another whisper, soft, but now unmistakable. "Look again." I didn't want to look. My body trembled, but curiosity and fear battled in my mind. I slowly turned, expecting to see that distorted reflection in the rearview mirror, or maybe a figure in the shadows, but there was nothing, only the dark, empty highway stretching into the distance. "Please, stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My parents were still talking up front, oblivious to my panic. I felt trapped, unable to escape whatever was following me. A third whisper came, closer this time, as though it was right in my ear. "Turn around." I couldn't resist anymore. My head snapped back, eyes wide, searching the dark space behind me. And that's when I saw it. The faintest movement, a shadow, shifting in the seat next to me. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its form was blurry, almost liquid-like, blending with the dark. It was there, watching me. My breath hitched as I stared, my mind screaming for me to look away, but I couldn't. My body was paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to look anywhere else but at the figure. It shifted again, leaning closer. Its presence felt like a cold wind pressing against my skin. "Don't look," it whispered again, but this time I knew I couldn't turn away. Tears welled in my eyes as I forced myself to look forward, staring out at the dark road ahead. The whispers stopped, and the sensation of being watched faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking in the shadows of my mind. When we finally reached home, I didn't say a word. I wasn't sure if I could explain what I had seen, or if they would even believe me. But every time I close my eyes, I can still feel it. The whisper in my ear, the eyes that followed me, the shadow sitting right beside me, waiting. It started as a simple trip to the old lighthouse, a place my family had visited countless times. We used to come here to watch the sunset, the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below, the lighthouse casting its beam out over the water. This time, we decided to stay overnight, hoping for a quiet escape from the routine of life. The lighthouse stood tall and solitary at the edge of the rocky cliffs, its paint peeling and windows grimy from years of neglect. It wasn't operational anymore, but the view from the top was still breathtaking. Vast stretches of sea, endless skies, and the horizon meeting the horizon, uninterrupted. We set up our small tent a little ways down from the lighthouse, out of view from the old structure, and settled in for the evening. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the cliffs. As the sky darkened, the air became colder, the saltwater breeze sharp against my face. The sounds of the ocean became louder, more rhythmic, as if the waves themselves were trying to communicate. That's when things started to feel off. The usual quiet of the night was disrupted by strange, faint whispers carried on the wind. I shrugged it off at first, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the whispers weren't constant. They came and went, drifting in and out like ghostly echoes. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. My family was asleep in the tent, oblivious. Then I noticed something peculiar. The lighthouse, standing dark and foreboding, had always felt like a landmark, a safe beacon of light in the darkness. But now it felt different. It wasn't just that it was no longer operational. It felt like it had a presence of its own. I felt watched. I decided to climb up to the lighthouse, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. The inside of the structure was cold and damp, the smell of aged wood and salt overwhelming. Dust particles danced in the faint moonlight that filtered through the grimy windows. I took the stairs to the top, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. At the top of the lighthouse, I stood in awe of the view. But as I looked out across the horizon, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the cliff, far below. It was too far for me to make out any details, but it stood motionless, like a statue. I squinted, trying to focus, but the figure didn't move. My heart pounded. I called out, but there was no response. The wind carried my voice away. I wanted to go back down, but something held me there. The figure remained, staring, unmoving. I turned to leave when I heard a sound, the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs behind me. My blood ran cold. I was alone. There was no reason for anyone else to be there. I spun around expecting to see nothing, but there it was. A figure at the top of the stairs, eerily still, its face obscured by the shadows. My breath caught, and I backed away slowly, my legs trembling. As I descended the stairs, I could feel the figure following, its presence closer now as if it were breathing down my neck. When I reached the bottom, I bolted toward the tent, heart racing, the whispers now louder, more insistent. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers didn't stop. In the morning, when my family woke, there was no sign of the figure, just the sound of the ocean and the wind. But the feeling remained, the feeling that we weren't alone, that whatever had watched me from the cliff was still out there, waiting. I still remember that trip to the old library. It wasn't like the modern ones with glass walls and computer stations. This library had a heavy, musty smell, old wooden shelves creaking beneath countless books, the kind of place that felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. My friends and I had stumbled upon it while wandering through a quiet, forgotten town. The library sat at the edge of a narrow, winding street. We were drawn to it, not by any plan, but by sheer curiosity. It looked abandoned, its windows cracked, paint peeling from the facade. The sign above the entrance swayed gently in the wind, its faded letters barely readable. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, as though the space itself had been sealed off from the world. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light. I remember feeling a strange stillness, as if the room itself was holding its breath. There was no one there, just the four of us. We wandered through the aisles, running our fingers along the spines of the old books, their titles long forgotten. The atmosphere was strange, almost oppressive. The silence seemed to throb, each creak of the wooden floorboards louder than it should have been. It wasn't until I stumbled across an old journal resting on one of the shelves that things started to feel off. The journal was thick, its cover worn with age. I opened it, curious, and began flipping through the pages. The handwriting was shaky, filled with strange symbols and passages that made no sense. Some entries were incomprehensible. Others spoke of things that shouldn't be known. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the scribbles, my hands trembling as I flipped further. But what truly unsettled me was a single line written on the very last page. It was as if someone had scrawled it in a panic, hurried and jagged. They are watching. They have always been watching. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something. Anything. But the library remained empty. The others were still exploring, oblivious to the unease that had taken hold of me. I hurried to put the journal back, but when I turned around, the air grew colder. A shadow shifted in the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the same old shelves and the thick silence. My friends returned, laughing about some old book they'd found. I couldn't tell them about what I had seen. What if they thought I was imagining things? Or worse, what if they laughed it off like it was nothing? We stayed for a while longer, trying to enjoy the quiet atmosphere. But every so often, I felt those eyes again. Watching, always watching. The feeling stayed with me long after we left the library, and to this day, I wonder who or what was there, waiting for us. I've always loved taking long drives at night. There's something about the stillness of the road, the faint hum of the tires, and the endless expanse of darkness stretching out before you. It was during one of these late-night drives that everything changed. It was a crisp autumn night. The stars were scattered like dust across the sky, and the full moon cast a pale glow over the countryside. I wasn't in a rush, just taking a leisurely drive, letting the quiet wash over me. The road was empty, barely any cars, just me and the road stretching endlessly ahead. I hadn't realized how far I'd driven until I started feeling that odd sense of isolation, the way everything seems to go silent as you leave civilization behind. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a stretch of road that felt like it went on forever. I was tempted to turn back, but something about the quiet was comforting. That's when I saw it. It was a figure standing by the side of the road. Just standing there, perfectly still. My first thought was that they were waiting for a ride, maybe a hitchhiker, but there was something off about them. They were too still, too rigid. I slowed down, trying to get a better look, but the closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. Their face was obscured, hidden in shadow. They were wearing a tattered jacket, with their hands stuffed into the pockets. I couldn't make out much more. I debated whether to stop, whether to offer help, but there was something so unsettling about the figure that I couldn't bring myself to stop. I drove past, my heart thudding harder as I forced myself to look away. But as I continued down the road, I realized that no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The unease had followed me, clinging to my every thought. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but empty road. But what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The figure was still there, only now they were walking down the middle of the road, head turned in my direction. They moved slowly, like they were gliding instead of walking. I couldn't make out their face, but their silhouette was etched into my memory. Tall, thin, and completely still. Panic began to set in. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, the sound of the tires squealing in my ears. The figure kept pace, never speeding up, never breaking stride. It was as though they weren't even affected by the car speeding past them. It was like they didn't care. I don't know how much time passed. The only sound was the roar of my engine and the relentless ticking of my heartbeat. The figure didn't vanish, didn't change. They were just there, walking as though they were tethered to the road itself. I pulled over after what felt like an eternity, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The silence outside was deafening. I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror again. The road was empty. No figure, no trace of anyone. But as I sat there, frozen in place, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching me. Waiting. To this day, I wonder if I ever really escaped them, or if they were waiting for me the next time I drove through the night. It was a scorching summer day when I decided to go for a drive. I'd always loved the open road. There was something freeing about it, something that made me feel alive. That's what I told myself, at least, as I packed some snacks and set off, not really knowing where I was headed. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the cracked, dusty roads. I didn't care about the destination, just the journey. Hours passed as I cruised through deserted country roads, the only sound being the low hum of my car and the occasional rustling of wind through the tall grass. As the sun began to set, I found myself driving past an old, long-forgotten cemetery. It was small, nestled between rolling hills and forgotten farmland, surrounded by a thick, weathered iron fence. The gate was hanging open, creaking slightly in the breeze. Something about it drew me in, though I wasn't sure why. I decided to stop, telling myself I was just curious. The cemetery was eerily silent, the headstones leaning at odd angles, barely readable beneath a thick layer of moss. I wandered through the rows of graves, each one worn and forgotten. The sunlight was fading fast, and I felt the oppressive quiet closing in around me. There was something wrong about this place. Not just the silence, but the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the light itself was bending around the graves. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an old, crumbling mausoleum that the feeling of unease became too much to ignore. The door hung open, rusted and creaking as if inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the faint smell of decay lingering in my nostrils. The walls were lined with faded, crumbling inscriptions, each name barely legible. I moved deeper into the darkness, my flashlight casting shaky beams across the space. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the room, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat as I froze. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its shape was twisted, features distorted in the dim light. Hollow eyes stared blankly at me, and I could see cracks running through its skin, almost as if it were made of clay that had been left to crack and decay. Who's there? My voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed unnaturally through the mausoleum. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me. The oppressive silence grew thicker, and I took a hesitant step back. The flashlight flickered, casting shifting shadows that danced around the walls, making the figure look more monstrous with every movement. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those hollow, staring eyes. There was a low, grating sound, like gravel being dragged across stone, and suddenly the figure stepped closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I backed further into the shadows. My flashlight illuminated more of the room, revealing cracks in the floor, the walls, even in the ceiling above. It felt as though the very structure of the mausoleum was breaking apart. Then came the whisper, soft, barely audible, yet it seemed to echo in my head. You shouldn't be here. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, distorted, and came from all around me. I felt the weight of it pressing down on my chest as if the very air had grown heavier. My breath quickened and I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the door. But as I reached for it, I felt something cold and clammy brush against my arm. I spun around, the flashlight barely illuminating the space. The figure was right behind me now, closer than I had realized. It reached out, long, bony fingers extending, and I could see the cracks running across its skin, the same as the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It didn't need to speak again. I already knew it wasn't going to let me leave. I screamed, a sound that echoed off the cold, damp stone. But then, everything fell silent once more. When I woke, the sun was high in the sky, and the cemetery was silent as if nothing had ever happened. My car was parked where I'd left it, the gate still swinging gently in the breeze. But I didn't dare go back inside the mausoleum. I couldn't bring myself to. It was a quiet afternoon when my friends and I decided to visit a secluded beach. The sun was high in the sky, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was the only thing breaking the silence. We had heard about this beach from someone who had described it as peaceful, remote, and the perfect place to escape from the noise of the world. We loaded up the car and drove for hours, leaving the familiar city behind. The drive was long, but the scenery changed from bustling streets to endless fields and towering cliffs as we got further from civilization. By the time we parked, we were surrounded by nothing but sand, sea, and the distant cries of seagulls. The beach was stunning. The sand stretched out in front of us, seemingly untouched by human footsteps. The waves crashed gently, and the smell of salt water filled the air. We set up camp, unpacked our things, and made a small fire to cook some food. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the beach, and we relaxed, enjoying the quiet. But something felt off. It wasn't the usual peace you'd expect from a place like this. It was more than just solitude. There was a strange stillness, almost like the world had stopped breathing. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the quiet of being far from everything. As the sun set, casting brilliant orange and pink hues across the horizon, we heard something strange, a faint, muffled sound, almost like faint whispers carried by the breeze. We exchanged glances, but none of us said anything at first. Maybe it was just the wind, we told ourselves, but the whispers didn't go away. The darkness fell quickly after the sun disappeared, and that's when things got weirder. We were sitting by the fire talking quietly when a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. It looked like a man, but there was something wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though its bones were bending the wrong way. We all froze, unable to look away as the figure walked toward us, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The whispers became clearer now, but they weren't words. They were like a low, guttural sound, almost a chant. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound that we could understand. It just kept coming, step by step, dragging one foot behind the other. Panic set in, but none of us could move. We watched, unable to look away as the figure came closer. The sound of the waves grew louder, but the figure didn't stop. It was getting closer to the edge of the firelight, and I could see its face, if you could even call it that. Its skin was stretched too tight, as if it had been stretched thin like old paper, with hollow sunken eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, staring at us with those lifeless black eyes. The whispers grew louder, almost a wail now, and the wind howled. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it turned and walked back into the darkness, vanishing into the shadows without a trace. We were too afraid to speak, too terrified to move. The fire crackled, and we sat there, shivering in the cold night, listening to the sound of the waves. The whispers had stopped. The figure was gone. We never saw anything else that night, but to this day, I still hear those whispers in my dreams. There was something about that beach, something ancient, something that should have stayed hidden beneath the waves. I was in the middle of a road trip driving through endless stretches of desert. The sun had set hours ago, and now it was just me and the empty highway. There wasn't a single car in sight, nothing but the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone. I had been driving for what felt like forever, searching for the next gas station or even a small town, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the horizon like a thin line against the sky. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and the only sound in the car was the steady hum of the engine. I was starting to feel uneasy. Everything about this trip had felt off since the moment I left. The air was dry and still, not a whisper of wind or even the faintest rustle of leaves. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The low fuel light blinked on, warning me that I needed to find something soon. My eyes searched the horizon, hoping for a sign of life, a flicker of light, anything. But the desert was vast and empty, stretching out in all directions. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw something. In the distance, a faint glow of light, maybe a gas station or a motel. I couldn't tell which from this far away. But hope surged through me, and I pushed my foot down harder on the gas pedal. As I got closer, the light became clearer. It wasn't a gas station or a motel. It was a building, old and crumbling, its walls covered in cracked paint. A small, flickering sign hung above the entrance, barely legible in the fading light. It read, "The Oasis." My stomach twisted. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But at this point, I didn't care. I needed fuel, water, something, anything to keep going. I parked my car in front of the building and stepped out, the heat still radiating off the pavement. The air smelled dry and dusty, the kind of scent that clings to your throat. The front door creaked open as I pushed it. Inside, it was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs dangling from the ceiling. The shelves were empty, covered in a thick layer of dust. The coolers were all shut, ice long melted. It felt more like a ghost town than a place meant to serve travelers. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. No reply. I moved through the aisles, hoping to find a supply of water or something to drink. But there was nothing. The only sound was my footsteps echoing against the cracked tile floor. It was eerie. The silence felt oppressive, as if the desert had swallowed up everything, leaving only this empty space behind. I made my way to the back of the store, where an old counter sat, covered in cobwebs. A small radio sat there, its antenna bent, dust coating its surface. I picked it up, hoping maybe I could get some signal, but static hissed from the speaker. Nothing but dead air. Desperation started to set in. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. I had no idea how far I was from anything. I was isolated, completely alone in this vast, empty desert. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed from the direction of the front door. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, soft, deliberate, steady. It wasn't the wind. It didn't sound like something natural. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I crept toward the front, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from outside, but somewhere inside the building. I couldn't tell where exactly. It sounded like it was right in front of me, but there was nothing there. I turned to look back at the counter, and that's when I saw it. A dark shape standing behind the glass. It wasn't human. It had no distinct features, just a shadowy, distorted form. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I didn't know how that was possible. My breath hitched as I stepped back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved closer, slow, deliberate. I could hear its footsteps, even though they shouldn't have made a sound on the dust-covered floor. I bolted for the door, fear clouding my vision. The creaking footsteps followed me, closer now, as though it was right behind me. I threw open the door and sprinted into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was miles down the road, the building a distant blur behind me. My car waited, humming quietly, the only sound I could hear. I never went back. I don't know what I saw that night or if it was even real, but sometimes, when I drive through the desert, I wonder if I'll see that building again, or if something else will come for me. I never thought a simple evening trip to the beach could turn into something so terrifying. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quick getaway with a few friends. Just a drive down to the coast, a few hours of quiet by the water, and the calm of the waves lapping against the shore. We arrived around sunset, the sky a canvas of deep oranges and purples. The beach was nearly empty, save for a few other couples and a group of friends setting up a fire further down. The air was crisp but not cold, the sound of the waves a soothing backdrop. My friends and I found a spot near the water, spread out our blanket, and cracked open a few beers. It was perfect, peaceful, relaxing. We talked about nothing important, watching the horizon as the sun dipped lower into the sea. It was when the sky went dark that things started to feel off. The first clue came when I noticed the distant glow of a single flashlight, bobbing up and down as if someone were walking toward us along the shore. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe someone out for a late-night stroll. But then I noticed the way the light kept moving erratically, as if they couldn't decide where they were going. "Hey, does anyone else see that?" I asked, pointing toward the light. My friends followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. "Probably just someone lost," one of them shrugged, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The closer the light got, the more it seemed to flicker, as though whoever was carrying it couldn't see what they were doing. It bobbed and darted erratically, weaving along the water's edge like something lost at sea. Then, suddenly, the light disappeared. I was about to dismiss it when a low, guttural moan carried over the sound of the waves. My friends froze, glancing around. "What was that?" someone whispered. We all strained our ears, searching the darkness. The moan came again, this time louder, more distinct. It didn't sound human, more like a creature, something primal and unsettling. The moans echoed between the cliffs, bouncing across the empty beach. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice trembling. We grabbed our stuff and started walking back toward the car, the unease growing with every step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the darkness, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of black beach stretching before us. It wasn't until we reached the car that the second clue hit me. My phone buzzed. No service. Not a single bar. The town was only about 20 minutes away, and usually we'd have signal. But now, nothing. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances as we climbed into the car. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As I drove, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror. The beach was behind us, just darkness now, but I still felt like something was there, something following us. That's when I saw it, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights. A figure, tall, thin, and hunched over, walking in the opposite direction from us, toward the shore. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who the hell is that?" one of my friends whispered, staring in shock at the figure. I couldn't answer. The figure didn't look human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying us from afar. And that flashlight, it wasn't being held properly. It bobbed erratically as if whoever was holding it couldn't see straight. The figure moved closer to the water's edge, fading in and out of the darkness, then stopped. It stood there, motionless, staring in our direction. My friends and I didn't wait to find out what it was. I hit the gas, tires squealing as we raced back toward town. The whole way, I kept glancing back, expecting to see the figure chasing us. But it was gone. When we got to the edge of town, I pulled over, gasping for air. The tension was still there, but nothing followed us. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us, waited, and we had been too blind to notice. We've never spoken of that night again. It was supposed to be a quiet evening walk through the old park, something I'd done countless times, but that night was different. Something about the air felt wrong, thick and oppressive. The sun had just set, casting the park in an eerie twilight, and as I strolled along the worn path, I noticed the usual sounds of the city had disappeared. No distant traffic hum, no birdsong, just silence. I wasn't far from the entrance when I realized something wasn't right. The atmosphere had changed entirely. The usual chirps of insects muted to nothing. It felt as though the world had stopped. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement, and I turned to glance behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just empty darkness. I picked up my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. Shadows stretched long and thin across the path ahead, stretching beyond what was normal, and they seemed to shift unnaturally as though they were alive. My breath quickened, and I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that nothing could possibly be out there. As I reached a bend in the path, I stopped. There, just a few feet away, stood a figure. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too distorted. The face, it wasn't a face, just a void, empty and black. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow sockets that seemed to absorb all the light around them. I couldn't look away. My body was frozen in place as it turned toward me, its movements jerky, like something inhuman trying to mimic the way a person walks. A soft, raspy noise escaped its hollow mouth, a sound that wasn't speech, but something far worse. Terror gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs refused to move. The thing began to advance, each step sending chills down my spine. I could feel its gaze boring into me, but when I tried to look at its face, there was nothing. Just darkness, endless and oppressive. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. The silence stretched, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes, but I couldn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and began to walk away, its elongated form retreating into the shadows. The sound of its footsteps faded, leaving behind only the oppressive silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before I found the courage to move. I stumbled back toward the park entrance, never daring to look behind me again. Whatever that thing was, I didn't want to find out. To this day, I still walk past that park, but I've never stopped looking over my shoulder. I was 13 when it happened, during a summer trip to my grandparents' old farmhouse. It wasn't just any trip, it was supposed to be a simple visit, full of farmland sunsets and lazy afternoons. But from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. The farmhouse itself was isolated, sitting at the edge of an overgrown field, far from any neighboring houses. My parents assured me it was just an old family home, quiet and peaceful. But from the moment I walked in, a strange sense of unease took hold. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The old wooden floorboards groaned under the weight of each step, and the creaking of the house seemed louder in the silence than it should have been. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a faint rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from inside the house, it was from outside. At first, I dismissed it as some small animal, maybe a bird or a raccoon, but the tapping grew louder and more deliberate as the hours passed. In the morning, I asked my grandmother about the noise. She shrugged, a little smile playing on her lips. Just the old trees. The wind does strange things out here. But the look in her eyes said she didn't believe it either. The days passed, but the tapping never stopped. It wasn't just random anymore. It was constant. I began to hear it even when I was awake, echoing through the empty halls of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and no matter where I went, I felt like I was being followed by unseen eyes. One afternoon, I decided to explore the surrounding fields. They stretched out for miles, untouched by modern life, just the way they had been for decades. The air was thick with the scent of hay and soil. The trees creaked gently as the wind picked up, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I wandered far from the farmhouse until I could no longer see the building. That's when I saw it. A figure. Not far from where I stood, barely visible beneath the branches of a gnarled oak tree. It wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, too tall, its form distorted as if it didn't belong in the world. I couldn't make out its face, only dark, hollow eyes that seemed to sink into its head, lifeless and empty. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still, unmoving, as though waiting for me. Slowly, I raised my hand, and with a trembling finger, I pointed. The figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, silent and endless. The tapping continued. Only now it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It seemed to come from within me, a dull rhythm that echoed in my ears. I felt like I was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something I couldn't understand. I don't know how much time passed before I finally turned and ran. My legs moved faster than they ever had, back toward the farmhouse. The figure never followed. It simply watched, unmoving, as I fled. That night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear the tapping. It was quieter now, but still there, persistent and unrelenting. I realized that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could run from. It had become a part of me. We left the farmhouse the next day, but the tapping never stopped. I can still hear it sometimes, especially in the quiet moments when I'm alone. It's there, just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. The quiet solitude of nature was something I craved, especially after long, stressful weeks. One summer afternoon, I decided to head to a remote trail I'd been eyeing for months. It wasn't marked on most maps, secluded deep in the forest. The trailhead was a dirt path hidden off a narrow road, barely visible to anyone passing by. The hike started as usual. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I reveled in the stillness, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sound of birds overhead. For hours, I trekked through the dense woods, following the winding trail deeper into the forest. The trail eventually began to narrow, the trees pressing in around me. It wasn't long before I realized I'd lost my bearings. I pulled out my map and compass, but neither gave me any clue as to which direction I should go. I sat down on a large rock, trying to collect my thoughts, but the sense of isolation began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I wasn't truly lost, just turned around. But as the hours passed and the sunlight dimmed, I started feeling something was wrong. The forest felt heavier. The usual sounds of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie quiet. It was as though the woods themselves had become aware of my presence. I pressed on, my pace quickening, though fear began to seep into my bones. I needed to get out of there. The trail eventually split into two. I didn't know which way to go, so I flipped a coin. Heads. I took the right path. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to loom, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. The sun had set, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Shadows danced in the light, appearing as figures just beyond my sight. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the sound of my own boots against the ground, but something lighter, quicker. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, approaching rapidly, echoing unnaturally close. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response, just the sound of rustling leaves. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, shining it in every direction. The forest felt alive now, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. I took off running, but the footsteps followed, always just behind me. I could hear them breathing, ragged and shallow, as though the thing was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back, but I knew whatever it wasn't human. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees bending and creaking with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. Exhausted, I collapsed against a tree, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell deathly quiet again. I could feel something watching me, something I couldn't see, yet I knew it was there, standing just beyond my sight. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the trees. The world around me seemed to blur, and then, in the dim light, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it wasn't human. Its presence radiated something cold, something inhuman. Tears streamed down my face as I turned and ran. The woods stretched endlessly, the path disappearing beneath my feet. I could hear it again, the sound of footsteps, lighter now but unmistakably close. And then, through the haze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of my flashlight's beam, I glimpsed something hanging from a tree, faint and twisted in the darkness. A figure, a face. It wasn't human, not anymore, just a hollow, warped shape that hung from the tree, swaying gently in the wind. I screamed and ran faster, but I knew it was always right behind me. I didn't stop, couldn't stop, until I burst out of the forest and stumbled into the light of day, gasping for air. I made it out, but even now, I can still feel it, watching, waiting, in the dark, just beyond the edge of sight. It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with a grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. The figure had vanished. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above, the creaking of footsteps, slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. It started as an ordinary day at home. I lived alone in a small apartment in the city. Nothing special ever happened, and I liked it that way. But one evening, everything changed. The air was crisp, and I decided to open my window to let in some fresh air. The sounds of the city drifted up, cars honking, distant voices, the hum of traffic. But that evening, it felt different. The usual background noise was quieter, as if the city had fallen into some strange kind of hush. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe everyone else was just quieter tonight. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, flipping through a book. But my focus was slipping. I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation, so I glanced toward the window. The street below was eerily quiet. No cars passed, no people walked by, It was like the world had suddenly gone still. I decided to step onto my balcony, which overlooked the narrow alley between my building and the next. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I leaned against the railing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. I swear, the alley had never looked this dark before. The street lamps that usually lit the way barely cast any glow tonight. Everything was in shadows. That's when I noticed it. Movement. At first, I thought it was a stray cat, but the figure that emerged from the darkness didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in ways that defied logic. It glided more than walked, its movements fluid but disjointed. I couldn't see its face, but there was something about the way it moved. So wrong, so unnatural, that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The figure seemed to float closer to my building, heading toward the alley where I stood. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I was too scared to look back outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the door, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The next day, I didn't see anything unusual, but the fear lingered. I went about my routine, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept the lights on in every room, my eyes darting between the windows and the dark spaces beyond. Around midnight, I heard a soft knocking at the door. My heart stopped. I froze, my breath hitching. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side was counting each tap. I grabbed my phone and backed away, heart racing. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. There was no response, just that relentless knocking. I stood there, unable to move, listening to the sound echo through my apartment. Then came a louder knock, followed by the faintest whisper, barely audible, "Let me in." I bolted the door and hid under my bed. I didn't come out until morning, my mind in a fog of fear and disbelief. To this day, I never found an explanation for what I saw or heard. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something human. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness, but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait, as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes, staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was late spring when I decided to take a trip to the old lighthouse. Located on a rocky outcrop overlooking the coast, it wasn't a place people visited often. Most locals whispered about how the lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and doors rusted shut. Despite the warnings, I always had a fascination with places like this, forgotten, isolated, and steeped in mystery. I parked my car at the edge of the cliff and climbed over the low fence that marked the entrance. The air was salty and thick with the smell of the ocean. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its worn brick exterior covered in moss. It was both haunting and beautiful in the fading light. I pushed open the creaking metal door at the base of the structure and stepped inside. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, so I pulled out a flashlight from my backpack. The beam flickered, casting shaky light against the old stone walls as I made my way up. Each step echoed around me, amplifying the silence. It felt as though the place had been waiting for me, abandoned and forgotten. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the air became, growing colder with each passing floor. By the time I reached the top, I was surrounded by the familiar smell of dust and decay. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out before me, waves crashing against the cliffs below. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude, the silence. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the vastness of it all. But then I noticed something strange. In the distance, along the jagged coastline, there was movement. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I watched, it became clearer. A figure silhouetted against the horizon. They were standing there, unmoving, watching. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out who or what they were, but there was something unnerving about the way they seemed to hold perfectly still. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I had read too many old ghost stories about this lighthouse after all. I turned back to the view, trying to distract myself, when I heard it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear what was being said. The words were too soft, too distant, and yet they felt closer than they should have been. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I shined it into the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing. Still, the whisper persisted, growing louder. Panic began to set in. I had never believed in ghosts, but now, alone atop this desolate lighthouse, I wasn't so sure. The figure from earlier was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It felt like something was breathing down my neck. I began to make my way back down the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my grip. With each creak of the old wood, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down harder. The whispers didn't stop, but now they seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. By the time I reached the bottom, my legs were shaking, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The door I had entered through loomed ahead, the only way out. I tried to turn the handle, but it was stuck. I yanked at it, heart racing, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I realized something had locked me inside. Panic surged through me. I spun around, trying to find another way out, but the only way was up. The whispers had grown into screams now, echoing through the narrow corridors, but there was no one there. I stumbled back toward the staircase, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a lifeline. I kept climbing, each step feeling heavier, each echo more deafening. It was only when I reached the top that I saw them again, the figure from earlier. They were inside now, standing at the base of the staircase, staring up at me. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. There was no escape. I didn't scream. I didn't move. All I could do was watch as they began to ascend, their movements slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. It was a late afternoon when I found myself walking through an unfamiliar forest. The dense trees stretched endlessly, their branches arching over the narrow trail, casting long, wavering shadows that danced in the fading light. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd gotten lost after taking a wrong turn while hiking alone. My phone had died hours ago, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, leaving the forest in an unnatural twilight. My heart pounded as I tried to find a way back, but the trail seemed to have vanished, leaving only a maze of trees and endless undergrowth. As the sky darkened, a chill swept through the trees. I shivered, wishing I'd brought a jacket. The quiet was becoming suffocating, oppressive. Something about it felt wrong. The wind had stopped entirely, and the usual rustling of leaves was replaced by an eerie stillness that felt almost alive. I stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof caved in and windows broken, almost blending into the surrounding woods. It stood as if untouched by time, untouched by human life. I hesitated at the threshold, the memory of horror movies flashing in my mind. But the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. The interior of the cabin was dark, musty, and filled with the scent of decay. Old furniture lay scattered, rotting in the corners while cobwebs stretched from wall to wall. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. As I stepped further inside, the feeling of unease intensified, as if I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to thicken, in the cold that seeped into my bones. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just my nerves. I fumbled in my bag, pulling out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim darkness. The shadows around me writhed as I moved, forming distorted shapes on the cracked walls. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, as if someone were standing right beside me, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach twisted, and I swung the flashlight around, scanning the cabin. The only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath my feet. "Who's there?" My voice trembled, echoing in the hollow space. No answer. I listened closely, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper came again, but this time louder, clearer. It was a name, soft but unmistakable. Sarah. I froze. My name wasn't Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just empty, rotting furniture and the lingering darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the flashlight tighter, wondering if I was imagining things. Sarah. The voice was closer this time. My heart pounded as I realized it wasn't just in my head. It sounded familiar, almost like it was coming from inside my own thoughts. I stumbled toward the door, but as I reached out for the handle, I noticed something. Another whisper, fainter this time, coming from the corner of the cabin. Help. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A presence in the room, as if something was leaning over my shoulder, breathing cold air into my ear. I spun around again, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, repeating over and over again like a loop I couldn't escape. Desperate, I tore through the cabin, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but every corner was empty. Every step I took felt heavier, the air more suffocating. Then I heard it, closer than ever. A low, guttural voice right behind me. "Look." I whipped around, the flashlight beam illuminating the figure. But there was nothing, only my distorted reflection on the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. My breath hitched as I realized the reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror had hollow eyes, its face twisted in a sick grin, its mouth moving but no sound coming out. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The air went cold, the forest beyond the cabin silent again. I stood there, frozen, unable to move. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned back toward the door. As I pushed it open and stepped out into the fading light, I could feel something behind me. The whisper had vanished, but the echo of my name still hung in the air. It wasn't over. I've always loved spending my weekends exploring nature, far from the city lights and noise. A few friends and I decided to go on a hiking trip into the mountains, remote trails, hidden caves, and the promise of peace. We left early on a Saturday, driving for hours into the wilderness, leaving behind cell service and any form of modern convenience. The trailhead was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of insects buzzing in the heat. We set off, excited to lose ourselves in the trees and rocks. The trail was rough but rewarding, winding deeper into the forest as the day wore on. We didn't see a single person the entire time, just the distant sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We stopped to rest after a few hours, finding a small clearing by a bubbling stream. It was serene, perfect for a break. We filled our bottles with cold water and spread out our packs, eating snacks and laughing. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. After eating, we decided to explore further. The trail continued on, snaking around the mountain, but something felt off. The quiet was louder than before, almost oppressive. My friends joked about how strange the silence was, but I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we were deep in the woods that we noticed the marks on the trees. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the bark, running high and low, as if something large had passed through. I stopped, staring at them. My stomach churned. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked, pointing. "No way," one of my friends replied, laughing. "Bears don't make marks like that. Look, these are way too high." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The idea of a bear, or anything large, hadn't crossed my mind, but these marks were unnatural. We looked around, but the trees seemed lifeless, their silence stretching into an eerie stillness. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. We decided it was time to head back, but something wasn't right. It felt like we were walking in circles, the trail no longer familiar. When we stopped to check our maps, we realized it wasn't the trail that had shifted. It was us. We weren't lost exactly, but we were disoriented, unable to find the landmarks we remembered. The air felt thicker, as though the forest had swallowed everything familiar. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked the same. Every tree felt like a stranger. We finally decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to rest. As night fell, the forest became even more silent. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife had vanished, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. My friends drifted into restless slumber, but I stayed awake, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Every little noise made me jump. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew something was watching us. I just couldn't explain how I knew. At some point, I heard it. A low, distorted whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the trees, as if something was calling to us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. "Come. Closer." The voice was not human. It was hollow, distant, like it came from the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, heart pounding. I woke my friends, but the whispering stopped as soon as they opened their eyes. The forest returned to silence. They didn't hear it. They didn't see anything. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew what I'd heard. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left us. It was still there, waiting. In the morning, we packed up and made our way back down the mountain, moving as quickly as we could. The woods were still quiet, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I looked behind us one last time. The trees loomed taller, darker, and deep within them, I knew we weren't alone. It was a hot, quiet summer day when we decided to take the old boat out. My friends and I had grown up near the lake, and on weekends we'd usually head out to fish or just escape the dull routine of life. That day was supposed to be no different. We packed the boat with supplies, beer, snacks, and fishing gear, and set off. The lake stretched out before us, endless and still. The surface shimmered under the sun, and apart from the occasional call of a bird, there was nothing but silence. We didn't talk much, the kind of peace that comes from knowing each other so well. You don't always need to fill the quiet. We anchored the boat in the middle of the lake, far from the shore, where the water was deepest. We tossed our lines into the water and relaxed, letting the day stretch out before us. The surface of the water rippled gently, and I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, letting my thoughts drift. It was one of those perfect summer afternoons. Hours passed. I'd started to doze off when something woke me, a faint, distant thud. I sat up, blinking into the sun. The others didn't seem to notice. The thud came again, faint but persistent, like something heavy being dragged across the water. I frowned and looked around, but the lake remained eerily still. I shook off my unease, convinced it was nothing more than my imagination. The water was calm, no signs of boats or other people in sight. I was about to lie back down when I noticed something. Just a ripple in the water. Something moving just beneath the surface. At first, I figured it was a fish or maybe even a log, but the more I watched, the more it seemed unnatural. It wasn't just a ripple, it was deliberate, as if something was swimming just beneath us, circling the boat. "Guys," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. They didn't respond, lost in their own world, fishing lines slack in the water. The thudding continued, now much louder, vibrating through the hull of the boat. I glanced down into the water again, heart pounding. The ripple grew closer. I saw something, just for a split second. 2 dark shapes moving beneath the surface. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The boat was silent except for the relentless thudding and the faint dragging sounds beneath us. The water seemed to grow darker, almost as if it were being pulled down into some unseen void. I had to wake my friends. "Guys, get up, something's wrong," I shouted, my voice trembling. They stirred, groggy but alert. I pointed toward the water, struggling to find words. My throat felt dry. "There's something down there. I don't know what it is, but it's not natural." They peered over the edge, eyes widening as they saw the dark shapes in the water. "What the hell is that?" one of them whispered. The thudding grew louder, and we could feel the vibrations in the floor of the boat. Something was approaching from beneath, something large. A chilling realization settled in my gut. Whatever it wasn't just a fish or a log. Panic swept through us. We didn't even bother pulling in our fishing lines. I grabbed the oars, and we frantically rowed toward the shore, the thudding and dragging noise growing louder, echoing beneath the surface. When we reached the shallower waters near the shore, the sounds stopped. The water became still again, unnaturally calm. We didn't look back, didn't dare. We made it home that day, shaken and silent. I've never been back to that lake. Whatever it was down there, whatever was dragging itself beneath the surface, I hope I never find out. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted, and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse, it was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea. It felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out. But the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it, or if I was the only one who ever would. It was a calm afternoon, the kind where the heat seems to bend the air. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the local beach, a place we'd visited many times before, but something felt different this time. The sun glared down from a cloudless sky as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk from the car, but there were fewer people than usual. We set up our towels and chairs, laughing as we dove into the cool water. The waves were gentle, the kind you don't think twice about. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We swam, played around, and enjoyed the simplicity of the day. It wasn't until later, when the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the shore, that things began to feel off. We were sitting on the sand, watching the horizon, when one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the water. "There's something out there," she said, her voice quieter than before. At first, I didn't see anything, just the vast expanse of blue stretching out to meet the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure far in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a swimmer or a surfer. It looked almost like a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly beneath the surface. The water didn't ripple in the way waves normally do. It was as if something was swimming just beneath, something large, something unnatural. "Is it a shark?" one of my friends asked, but none of us could answer. We all stood there staring at the spot where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The beach had become unnervingly quiet, save for the faint lapping of the waves. The sun had all but disappeared, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. "We should go," someone said. The idea of walking back to the car felt like a relief, but we couldn't shake the unease. The path back to the parking lot was dark and desolate, lined with dunes on one side and endless ocean on the other. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and we walked in silence. Halfway back, we stopped. There was a sound, something faint but unmistakable. A splash, not far from the shore, it echoed in the quiet evening air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but it was as if the world had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the waves. Then came the whispering. It started softly at first, almost like the wind, but we realized there wasn't any wind. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, whispers carried on the breeze. They were faint and incomprehensible, as if they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic gripped me. I could feel it in the way my heart pounded in my chest. We weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. "We need to get back now," one of my friends said, her voice trembling. As we hurried to the car, the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. It was as though the entire beach was alive, breathing, and the sound of those whispers seemed to come from everywhere. I kept turning, scanning the dunes and the water, but saw nothing. Yet the voices remained, growing more insistent, more sinister. We finally made it to the car, fumbling with the keys, heartbeats thudding in our ears. The moment we slammed the doors shut, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Driving away, we didn't speak much. All I could think about was that figure beneath the water, the whispers that seemed to follow us, and how wrong the beach had felt. When I glanced back, the beach was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there, waiting. I was on a road trip with some friends, driving through endless flatlands that stretched out like a forgotten world. It was just us. No towns, no cell service, just miles of dry, cracked earth and endless sky. We had set out from the city, heading toward some isolated national park that none of us had ever visited before. The sun had long since set by the time we realized we were lost. The GPS had been spotty from the beginning, and now, deep in the middle of nowhere, it had completely failed us. The horizon seemed to blur into itself, and the landscape looked more like a dream than reality. No lights from towns, no signs of life, just us and the desolation. As we drove, a fog rolled in, creeping along the ground like something alive. It wasn't cold, just oppressive. The air felt thick, and the quiet was unsettling. We passed what looked like old, rusted-out vehicles, abandoned long before we ever arrived. Each one was a monument to time's relentless march through this forgotten place. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, and the car came to a halt. We sat there, the silence pressing in on us. No wind, no noise, just the hum of our own anxious breathing. "It's out of gas," someone said, breaking the silence. I checked the tank. It was completely empty. The moonlight barely cut through the thick fog, casting everything in an eerie, washed-out glow. We stepped out of the car, the ground dry and cracked beneath our feet. The air was thick, almost like it pressed down on my chest. I felt a cold shiver run through me, but none of us spoke of it. We set out on foot, hoping to find some sign of life, some hint of civilization. The fog thickened as we walked, swirling around us, becoming more like a presence than a natural phenomenon. My friends began to whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something they didn't want to draw attention to. Hours passed in silence, or so it felt. The land seemed endless. The fog never lifted, and there was no relief from it. Eventually, we came across something that didn't fit. An old wooden structure, half buried by the earth, barely visible beneath the thick fog. We cautiously approached, hoping it might provide some shelter or clue. As we drew closer, I noticed something else: footprints. They were small, almost childlike, leading away from the building and into the darkness. They didn't seem natural, as though someone had deliberately walked there. Inside the structure, we found what remained of a small, forgotten homestead. Rusted tools, cracked furniture, and old, faded photographs of people who were long gone. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the weight of years gone by. That's when we heard the sound, the faintest whisper. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized my friends had stopped moving, frozen, their eyes wide with fear. It came again, more distinct this time. A voice, barely audible, calling from outside, but it wasn't like any voice I had ever heard. It was not human. It was hollow, distant, as though it came from some place beyond this world. Follow. The voice seemed to echo, twisting through the fog. My friends were visibly shaken. We had to get out of there. We had to run. But the fog was thick, blinding us to our surroundings, and the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. We stumbled back toward the car, but it felt like we were moving in circles. The structure faded behind us, lost in the swirling mists. The voice followed us, always just beyond reach. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the car, and something inside told me we shouldn't get in. But we did. As soon as the doors shut, the fog receded slightly. We could see the road again, though it stretched endlessly, vanishing into the horizon. The drive was long, and the silence oppressive. We didn't speak much. None of us could shake the feeling of being watched, as if the fog had followed us, waiting just out of sight. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. All I know is that something wasn't right, and I pray we never cross paths with whatever it was again. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. I'll never forget that summer afternoon when I went for a hike. I wasn't a hiker, far from it. I was out of shape, but the trails near the mountains had always called to me. The air was warm, the sun was bright, and the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I decided to take a trail that led deeper into the woods, away from the main paths and the familiar sounds of civilization. At first, everything seemed perfect. The birds chirped, the trees rustled gently in the breeze, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I wasn't exactly sure where I was going, but I didn't care. It felt freeing to be away from the constant noise of phones, people, and the city. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts drift as I lost track of time. Then the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't sudden, more like the gradual descent into something off. The birds stopped singing, and the forest became eerily silent. The air felt heavier, thicker. The light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer, almost unnatural. I noticed the shadows stretching longer than they should have, growing darker, more menacing. My stomach twisted. I stopped and looked around, unsure why I felt so uncomfortable. Everything seemed the same. Trees, rocks, the trail, but something wasn't right. My instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. Slowly, I turned in a circle, scanning the forest. There was no one, just the trees, endless and unchanging. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt eyes on me, watching. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail curved ahead, leading deeper into the woods, but I didn't want to go any farther. I wanted to turn back. My breath grew ragged, and with each step the sense of being followed only grew stronger. Then I heard it. The faintest whisper, just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like my name, softly spoken, carried on the wind. I froze. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. The forest was still, except for the sound of my own breathing. My head was spinning, and my chest felt tight. I kept walking, but every instinct in me told me to turn around and leave. I glanced back once, and for a moment I could swear I saw something. Just a flash of movement, disappearing behind a tree. My pace quickened, and as I did, the whispers began again, louder this time. They surrounded me, coming from all directions. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound of them sent chills down my spine. Panic gripped me. I wasn't thinking straight anymore. I ran. The trail twisted and turned, but I couldn't see the end. The woods felt endless, and the deeper I went, the darker everything became. I could barely make out the path beneath my feet. Then I heard it again. A voice, closer this time, clearer, more distinct. "Turn back," it said, but it wasn't human. It was hollow, distorted, like the echo of something long dead. "Leave this place." I stumbled, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't care about the trail anymore. Nothing mattered except getting out. My mind was screaming for answers, but I knew there weren't any. Suddenly, I burst out of the trees into a clearing. My eyes widened. There, in front of me, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, with skin that seemed to ripple like smoke. Its eyes were black, hollow, and empty. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with a cold, unsettling stare. I stopped, paralyzed by fear. My breath hitched and my legs felt like they would give out. But something inside me told me to run. I had to get away. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, but the forest seemed endless. Every shadow felt alive, every noise a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind me, something that had followed me from the moment I stepped off the trail. Hours later, I made it out. I don't remember much of the journey back, only that I kept running, not knowing if I'd ever escape. To this day, I don't know what that figure was or why it followed me. The forest isn't the same to me anymore. There's a quiet, lingering fear every time I step into the woods, a reminder of that day when I became lost in a world I couldn't explain. I never believed in strange things happening at home. The old house I grew up in was familiar, full of memories and comforting noises. But that night, everything changed. It was a quiet evening. I was alone, lying in bed with the windows open, listening to the distant hum of the city far away. The house had an odd creak here and there, but nothing unusual. My parents were away for the weekend, and I enjoyed the peace and quiet. Around 2 a.m., I woke to something that didn't fit with the usual night sounds. There was a faint knocking coming from the living room. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just soft, steady knocks, one after the other, slow and deliberate. At first I thought maybe I was imagining things, but the sound was too clear, too precise. I slipped out of bed, heart pounding. The hallway felt colder than it should have, the shadows deeper than usual. As I approached the living room, the knocking stopped. My breath hitched as I glanced around the room. Nothing was out of place. The furniture was as I had left it, and the windows were shut tight. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself it had been nothing. Then I heard it again, this time closer, sharper. Knocks, like someone tapping a finger against glass. I froze, stepping back into the hallway. I thought of waking up a neighbor, but the knocking didn't sound like it was coming from the front door. It was deeper, as if something was knocking from inside the walls. I hurried to the nearest window, peering out. The street was empty, silent. The only sounds were the faint hum of distant traffic and the echo of those knocks, still faint but growing louder. Panic set in. I tried calling my parents, but there was no signal. My phone was useless. I locked the front door and the back door, but the knocking didn't stop. It was as if whatever it was had moved inside the walls. As I stood there, my eyes fixed on the dark hallway, I noticed something strange. The knocking was synchronized with my heartbeat. Faster as mine raced, slower as I calmed. It was as if something was trying to match me, tracking me. Then came the whisper. A voice, barely audible, just beyond hearing. "Let me in." I spun around, but there was nothing. My pulse felt like it was going to explode. The whispers grew louder, almost pleading. The knocking had stopped, replaced by something even more chilling. Footsteps. Light, deliberate steps, echoing in the empty house. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The air felt thick, as though something had filled the space around me. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding. Finally, the whisper became clearer. "Let me in." The footsteps grew closer, slower, deliberate. I couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was making those sounds was right behind me. My hands trembled as I slowly turned around, expecting to find something, anything, but there was nothing. The house was still, only the faint hum of the fridge and the soft creak of the old floorboards. I don't know how long I stood there, too afraid to move, too terrified to speak. Whatever had been there, whatever was knocking, had vanished. When morning came, I checked every inch of the house. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs of anything unusual. I still don't know what happened that night, but I do know one thing. Whatever it was, it hasn't returned, and I pray it never does. It was a quiet summer evening when my family and I decided to visit the old abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for years, overtaken by weeds and forgotten rides rusting in the hot sun. The locals had always whispered strange stories about the park, rumors of eerie sounds, forgotten laughter, and ghostly apparitions. But we figured it'd be a fun adventure, something different from the usual weekend routines. As we arrived, the first thing that struck me was how still everything felt. There wasn't even the usual hum of insects, just a deathly silence. The entrance gate was broken, hanging open, as though it had been waiting for us. We made our way inside, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet echoing unnaturally loud. The park was larger than I had imagined, with rows of rides that looked like they had been forgotten by time. There was something eerie about the way the rides loomed over us, standing still, lifeless. The Ferris wheel sat motionless, its metal skeleton creaking as though it wanted to move, but couldn't. The funhouse with its broken windows looked like a hollow, crooked mouth, waiting to swallow whatever dared enter. We wandered through the park, taking it all in. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating. There was a strange smell, something metallic, mixed with decay. My dad insisted we move closer to the central plaza where the old carousel still stood. It was one of the last working attractions before the park shut down. But it wasn't just the carousel that caught my attention, it was the voices. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, whispering soft murmurs. But as we approached the plaza, I realized the sounds were coming from the carousel itself. A soft, eerie laughter. The kind of laughter that didn't belong in a place like this. Probably just the wind, Dad said, though his voice was quieter now, uncertain. But the laughter continued. Clearer, louder. It wasn't the wind. I stopped, frozen in my tracks. The sound came from the empty carousel, the horses frozen mid-gallop, their painted faces worn and cracked. I could hear them. Soft, childlike giggles, high-pitched and wrong, echoing across the dead park. Mom tried to assure me it was nothing. "It's just the old ride settling," she said, though her voice was shaky. But the laughter grew, becoming more distorted, more human. It didn't sound like kids playing. It sounded like something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin crawled. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was as if something was there, something else. Dad grabbed my hand and pulled me along, saying we needed to leave, but something about that laughter kept following us. We rushed toward the exit, passing the old concession stand. But then, just as we neared the gate, the air grew colder. The silence became louder again, like a vacuum. That's when I noticed it. The Ferris wheel, still sitting there, its broken lights flickering. Only, it wasn't empty anymore. At the top of the Ferris wheel, a figure stood, motionless, staring down at us with hollow, empty eyes. There was no face, no features, just a void where the eyes should be. And that laughter, that awful, distorted laughter, came from it. I turned to my family, screaming to run, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. The Ferris wheel lights stopped flickering, plunging the park back into darkness. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We got into the car and drove away as fast as we could, the laughter still ringing in my ears. To this day, I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever was there, it wasn't human, and it never left that amusement park. I had always loved taking long drives. There was something peaceful about winding roads and open landscapes, a way to clear my head and escape from the chaos of everyday life. One evening, after a particularly long and stressful week, I decided to take a spontaneous trip out into the countryside. The sun was setting as I pulled onto a narrow, winding road surrounded by forests on either side. The world felt silent, distant, almost untouched by time. I had no destination in mind, just the freedom of the open road. As I drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around me. The shadows grew darker, stretching long and menacing across the pavement. It was almost as if the forest itself was watching. I had the strange feeling that I was being pulled further into some unseen force. I passed a few old, crumbling signs for landmarks that no longer existed. The further I went, the less familiar everything became. The road twisted and turned, the forest thickening around me, swallowing any sense of direction or familiarity. That's when I saw her. At least, I think it was her. A figure, standing motionless by the side of the road. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress, her dark hair hanging over her shoulders. Her eyes were hollow, empty, as she stared straight ahead, not moving. I slowed down as I approached, unable to look away. My heart pounded as I passed by her, but something felt off. I glanced back in my rear-view mirror. She wasn't there anymore. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, empty and desolate. I shook my head, trying to brush off the lingering feeling of unease. Maybe I was imagining things, but something about that figure felt wrong. As I continued driving, I came to a sudden realization. I had no idea where I was. The road had changed. It wasn't just winding anymore. It felt like I was on a loop, repeating the same stretch of forest over and over. My panic grew as I pressed harder on the accelerator, hoping to break free from this endless cycle of trees. Then I noticed something strange. Lights. Not from my car, but from deep within the forest. Flickering, distant, like someone was trying to signal to me. I couldn't stop myself. I followed the faint glow deeper into the woods. The light grew brighter, and soon I could see a figure moving towards me. It wasn't the woman from before. This figure was taller, obscured by the thick shadows, but its eyes seemed to shine like dark pools. The closer I got, the harder it was to focus. The light was almost blinding now, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. The figure stepped into view, and I realized whatever this was wasn't human. Its face was distorted, twisted into something that wasn't quite alive. No features, no expression, just an abyss of darkness where its eyes should have been. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, only the oppressive silence of the forest. Panic took over, but my body refused to move. I wanted to look away, to turn the car around and drive back, but my gaze was locked on the creature. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure disappeared. The light faded, leaving me in the same endless darkness. I knew I couldn't stay. I spun my car around, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I drove as fast as I could, barely noticing the trees passing by, the landscape a blur of black and gray. Hours later, I found myself back on a familiar highway, far from the forest. My hands still trembled, and the weight of what I had seen pressed heavily on my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I've never gone back to that stretch of road, and I never will. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting.